My name is Natalie Greene. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Lakewood, Colorado, a city that people often pass through on their way to something else. That's how I always felt people treated me, like a stopover, temporary, replaceable, insignificant. But this is not just a story about me. This is a story about power, about pain, about being underestimated, until I decided to rewrite the ending myself. You see, when I was 21, I used to work for a local hardware company called Brickman Supply. It was the kind of place that ran on dust, sweat, and decades-old loyalty. I started at the front desk, answering phones, making coffee, and pretending to not hear the jokes whispered when I walked past the break room. Back then, I didn't have much. No degree, no fancy wardrobe, no connections, just this burning need to prove I could be more than what people thought of me. And they didn't think much. I remember the first time I heard it. She'll never be rich. She can barely keep up here. That was Donnie, one of the senior managers. He always smirked when I walked in. The kind of man who thought success belonged to people like him, with their tucked-in shirts and inherited confidence. What he didn't know was that every time he laughed behind my back, I stored it like fuel. Before I go any further, I want to hear from you. Yes, you. Drop your name and the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to know who's listening to this story, because what I'm about to share next is not just business. It's personal. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a real journey of being silenced, betrayed, and rising from the ashes stronger than ever. And if you've ever been told you're not enough, stay with me. This story might be exactly what you needed to hear today. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful true stories like this one. What made it worse was how collaborative their cruelty felt. Like a silent agreement that I didn't belong there. Not in management, not in finance, not in decision-making. I was the coffee girl, even after 3 years. Even after I started learning the logistics system better than some of the supervisors. Even after I brought in a client who doubled our sales in the Western region. Credit never came my way. Praise, even less. But humiliation? That was served hot and daily. There was this one day I'll never forget. A Friday. It had snowed hard the night before, and the power had gone out in half of the city. I still made it in. I brought blankets, flashlights, and even hot chocolate packets for the guys in the warehouse. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because no one else would. That afternoon, in front of everyone, Donnie called me into the office and said, "Natalie, you're sweet, but let's be honest. You're not exactly executive material." That sentence embedded itself into my bones. It was said with such ease, as if it were an objective truth, like gravity or snowfall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled, nodded, and walked out. But something changed that day. That weekend, I opened my laptop and began researching night courses. Business, finance, marketing, anything that could help me understand how the game was played. I realized that it wasn't just about working hard. It was about working smart. About learning to read numbers the way they read resumes. About turning every no into an education. Over the next few years, I worked 3 jobs. I cleaned office buildings after hours. I waited tables on weekends. I even took gigs reviewing college essays online. I saved every dime and poured it into my education. It wasn't glamorous. My apartment had cracked walls and a shower that hissed more than it sprayed. But I kept a photo of the Brickman office taped to my mirror. Not because I missed it, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to be overlooked. Fast forward to age 27. I had just finished my MBA through an online university and had been freelancing as a logistics consultant. One of my clients, a tech company expanding into construction supply, asked me to help them analyze potential local acquisitions. And guess what name popped up in the list? Brickman Supply. Their numbers were down. Way down. Turns out the leadership had been sleeping through the digital shift. Online ordering was a mess. Their inventory system was outdated. And Donnie? Still there. Still talking down to junior staff. Still operating like the year was 1999. The report I submitted was honest. Brutally so. 3 months later, Brickman was on the brink of bankruptcy. Their owner, Mr. Chandler, who I remembered as polite but largely absent, Reached out to the tech firm offering a silent acquisition at a low valuation. That's when I did something I had never done before. I made an offer myself. I had savings, I had backing from a few connections I built consulting, and I had a plan. Chandler agreed, likely because he didn't recognize me. Or maybe he didn't care. The paperwork took weeks, but the day it was finalized, I stood in front of the building, staring up at the worn-out sign, and whispered to myself, "Not executive material, huh? The first order of business? Change the name." I rebranded it Green Core Logistics. The second? A company-wide meeting. I walked into the main room wearing a navy blazer, hair pulled back, heels clicking against the tile. The same tile I used to mop after hours. Donnie didn't recognize me at first, but when he did, the color drained from his face. "Natalie?" he croaked. I stepped onto the platform and looked out at the people who once mocked me, ignored me, doubted me. And then I said something I'd been practicing in my mind for years. For those of you who said I'd never be rich, you were absolutely right. Back then. But today, I own this place. And if you ever called me not executive material, you're free to clock out one last time. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to gloat. The silence in the room did the heavy lifting. Some people applauded. Others packed up their things. Donnie? He just stood there, mouth half open, like he was finally witnessing the cost of his arrogance. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming power, the power to walk back into a place that broke me and build something new with my name on the door. And that was just the beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of restructuring. The first thing I did was bring in a team of young, hungry professionals, people who had ideas, who didn't wear superiority like a badge, and who actually listened. I hired a systems analyst from Denver, a marketing strategist from Boulder, and a woman named Clara, whom I had met years earlier at a business seminar. She remembered me instantly. "You're the one who took notes like your life depended on it," she said, smiling. I nodded. My life kind of did. Brickman Supply had been a relic of another era. Its old systems, outdated customer base, and prideful leadership had kept it barely afloat. But now, under the new banner of Green Core Logistics, we were building something leaner, faster, smarter. I knew the business from the inside, which gave me a strange kind of advantage. I remembered which processes wasted time. I knew which employees were being underutilized. And I remembered which customers had complained about slow orders or missing inventory. The revenge, though sweet, was not the purpose anymore. Not entirely. The deeper I got into rebuilding the company, the more I realized how much more I wanted than just proving people wrong. I wanted to prove myself right. I wanted to build something lasting, something that mattered. But that didn't mean everything was smooth. Donnie had left, of course. He didn't go quietly. On his last day, he left a note on my office door. In bold black ink, it read, "Let's see how long it takes before this place eats you alive." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I folded the paper, placed it in my desk drawer, and labeled it fuel. He wasn't entirely wrong. The business was drowning in debt. I had to renegotiate several contracts, fight for better supplier terms, and cut ties with clients who never paid on time. There were days I didn't sleep. Nights I cried in the parking lot before pulling myself together and walking back inside. Still, there were wins. Our new logistics software reduced order errors by 60% in the first 3 months. Our customer satisfaction rating, something no one had even tracked before, skyrocketed. We implemented online ordering and mobile tracking, which brought in an entirely new customer demographic: younger contractors, tech-savvy builders, and eco-conscious clients. It was working. Slowly, but surely, it was working. One afternoon, I walked past the break room and heard laughter. Real laughter, not the kind laced with condescension. The new team was celebrating hitting our first quarterly goal. There were cupcakes on the table. Someone had even drawn my face on a whiteboard, complete with the words, "Boss Queen." I couldn't help but smile. I remembered how it felt to walk past that room and feel invisible. Now I was part of the heartbeat. Still, the past had a way of creeping back. A few weeks later, I got a message from an old coworker named Jeremy. He had worked in finance back in the Brickman days. Always quiet, always polite. He asked to meet for coffee. Curiosity got the better of me, so I said yes. We sat in a small cafe near Belmar. He looked the same, only now with deeper lines on his face. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Back then, I should have spoken up. I saw what they did to you. The way they treated you. I didn't say anything, and I regret that." I studied him for a moment. It wasn't the apology I'd been waiting for, but it was more than I expected. "I appreciate that," I said. "I really do." He nodded. "Also, if you're ever looking for someone who knows this industry's financial ropes, I'm available." It would have been easy to say no, to turn him away the way I had once been turned away so many times. But I didn't. I told him to come by the office Monday morning. Maybe revenge didn't always mean shutting every door. Maybe sometimes it meant choosing which ones you were now powerful enough to open. As Green Core grew, so did my confidence. But not in the loud, boastful way I had once imagined. It was quieter. It lived in the way I made decisions, in the calm I carried into meetings, in the patience I had for mistakes. I knew what it was like to be inexperienced and eager. I wanted to nurture that in others. But some people didn't want me to succeed. A few of the old Brickman loyalists had stuck around, probably thinking I'd fail and sell the business back for pennies. They smiled during meetings, but I saw the doubt in their eyes. One of them, a man named Curtis, had been there for 25 years. He often told the newer staff, "We've seen CEOs come and go. Let's see how long this one lasts." I gave him chances. I offered him leadership training, a new role in the digital transition team. He declined them all. Eventually, I had to let him go. It wasn't personal. It was survival. He didn't go quietly either. "You think you're better than the rest of us," he hissed as he packed his things. "No," I replied softly. "I think I'm exactly who I needed when I started here." Word began to spread in the local business community. Green Core was the underdog story everyone wanted to know about. A young woman who bought the company that once belittled her. It was the kind of narrative that sold magazine covers and podcast interviews. I declined most of them. I didn't want to be a novelty. I wanted to build an empire. But one invitation caught my eye. A panel discussion on women in leadership, hosted by the Colorado Business Network. I almost ignored it, but something told me to say yes. The day of the event, I stood on stage in front of hundreds of women, students, entrepreneurs, managers, and told my story. When I said the title of the panel out loud, they said I'd never be rich. A hush fell over the room. I paused, looked at the audience, and finished. "So I bought their business," and fired them all. Laughter, applause, even some tears. That night, I went home and sat on my porch with a glass of wine. The mountains in the distance were covered in snow, glowing under the moonlight. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who cried in the storage closet after being told she was replaceable. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, "It's going to be hard, but one day, they'll say your name with respect, and that would be worth everything." The funny thing is, the richer I became, financially, emotionally, spiritually, the less I cared about proving anything to them. My revenge was never about destruction. It was about resurrection, about building from the ashes they left behind. And that's exactly what I was doing. It was early spring when everything shifted. The kind of morning where the sky looks cleaner than usual, where the air feels sharper, more alert, as if something's coming and the world knows it before you do. I was already at the office by 6, sipping my first cup of bitter coffee and reviewing warehouse reports. Green Core had expanded rapidly, faster than even I expected. We'd secured a government contract, added 2 satellite hubs in northern Colorado, and doubled our client base in under a year. The success felt electric, but I knew better than to trust calm skies. Growth, especially the kind we were experiencing, came with storms. It started with a letter, a plain white envelope left on my desk without a stamp, without a name. I opened it without thinking much. Inside was a typed message. "Careful who you trust. Not everyone wants you to succeed." I read it twice. Then again. My gut tightened. I didn't know what it meant, but the warning rattled something in me. I'd built a team I believed in, people I'd invested time and trust into, but suddenly every interaction felt different. Every glance, every pause in conversation. I started wondering who wrote it and why. Paranoia is like rust. It doesn't show at first, but once it starts, it eats through everything. That same week, I noticed inconsistencies in our accounts. Small things at first: a shipping invoice that didn't match, a payment flagged twice, a client complaining about a missed delivery we had no record of. I called in Jeremy, the finance guy I had given a second chance to. He looked tired, stressed in ways he hadn't been before. "We're growing too fast," he said. "Our systems aren't catching up." But that didn't sit right with me. I'd spent months designing our systems, double-checking their integrity, hiring top-tier IT consultants. This wasn't sloppiness. It was something else, something intentional. The pressure mounted quickly. A major order went missing, an entire truckload of electrical supplies for a Denver construction site. That mistake cost us thousands in refunds and penalties. One of our competitors, North Edge Logistics, picked up the slack. The same week, 2 of my department heads quit without warning. No notice, no exit interviews, just silence. I called an emergency meeting. The room was tense. My leadership team, what was left of it, sat around the table, eyes darting, waiting. I placed the anonymous note at the center. "Someone wants this company to fall," I said, "and they're working from the inside." Clara was the first to speak. "Do you think it's someone we know?" I looked at each of them slowly. "I think it's someone we trust." It was one of the hardest moments I'd faced as a leader. Not because I was scared, but because for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alone again. The kind of loneliness that reminds you of your first rejection, your first humiliation, the kind that whispers, "You were never meant to lead." But I wasn't the same woman I had been. I didn't crumble. I hired a cybersecurity firm and a private investigator the next day, quietly, discreetly. No one on the team knew. If there was a traitor in the house, I wasn't going to give them the upper hand. For the next 3 weeks, I played the role of a calm CEO while every part of me was on high alert. I smiled during meetings, laughed at birthday cupcakes, signed checks, attended panels. But I didn't sleep. I didn't rest. Then the report came in. It wasn't what I expected. Jeremy, the one who had apologized, who had seemed so genuine, so grateful, had been feeding internal documents to North Edge. He'd been recruited 6 months prior, promised a position, a bigger one, better salary, more prestige. All he had to do was slowly undermine Green Corps from the inside, leak our supplier rates, sabotage contracts, delay shipments. I sat with the report in my hands, numb. There was a photo, Jeremy shaking hands with North Edge's CEO at a gala, taken just a week after our contract with the government was finalized. All smiles, suits, champagne. Betrayal is different when it comes from someone you tried to save. It scrapes deeper. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I scheduled a meeting with Jeremy for the following morning. He walked into my office like it was any other day, holding his laptop and a travel mug. "You wanted to see me?" I nodded. "Close the door." He did. I handed him the folder. "I know everything." His face shifted, not in fear, but in resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said softly. "You think that makes a difference?" "I had debts," he started. "Family things. They offered me something I couldn't turn down." "I didn't mean to hurt you, Natalie." "You didn't hurt me," I replied. "You hurt this company. You hurt every person here who trusted you." He sat down, head in hands. "I thought I could manage both, help them, keep things stable here. But it got too complicated. Get out." He looked up. "What?" "You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. And if you try anything else, I'll sue. Personally. I have the report, the photos, the bank transfers." His jaw clenched, but he stood. "You know what your problem is? You think being the boss means you're untouchable, but people like me, we always find ways in." I stood too. "And people like me? We survive, we rebuild, and we don't forget." As he left, I felt an unfamiliar mix of fury and grief. He hadn't just betrayed my company. He'd betrayed the version of myself that had believed in redemption, that believed people could change. But the fallout wasn't over. News of the sabotage leaked to local business circles. Clients started calling, unsure of our stability. Rumors spread fast that we were imploding, that leadership was crumbling, that Green Corps was just another failed startup disguised by a flashy comeback story. That week, I held another meeting, this time, company-wide. I stood in front of the entire team, looked them all in the eye, and told them the truth about Jeremy, about the sabotage, about the fight ahead. I won't pretend we're not hurting, I said, but I will promise you this. We're not going down. We've built something too strong, too honest, too needed. And if you're with me, truly with me, we will rise. They stood, one by one, applauding, some with tears in their eyes. That was the moment I realized that power doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being believed in, from telling the truth when it's hard, from facing the fire without flinching. We doubled security, reviewed every contract, repaired every damaged relationship, one call at a time. Clients stayed. Some even sent notes of support. One of them wrote, "You've got fire, Natalie. That's rare. We'll keep rooting for you." The turning point wasn't just firing Jeremy, it was choosing to lead through it, choosing not to let betrayal define me. I had spent so much of my early life being underestimated, stepped on, mocked, and for a moment, it seemed like history was repeating itself. But this time, I didn't back down. I stood up, stronger, clearer, more certain of who I was and what I was capable of. They had said I'd never be rich, but I wasn't just rich in money anymore. I was rich in resilience, rich in clarity, rich in people who believed in something real, and I was just getting started. The weeks following the company-wide meeting were some of the hardest of my life. I had taken the stage with confidence, igniting hope in my team, but behind the curtain I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, physically. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after a storm, when you're standing in the wreckage, still breathing, but unsure where to place your first step. I spent long hours walking the floor of the warehouse, running my hand over shelves, observing the team working, listening to their conversations, their ideas, their fears. I had to be visible, present, even if part of me just wanted to hide. That spring, I stopped taking weekends off, not because I didn't trust my team, but because I needed to prove something to myself, that I could carry this, that the cracks in the foundation hadn't made me weaker, they had made me more aware. I implemented something new, weekly town halls. Every Friday, anyone could step up and ask a question, raise a concern, or share an idea. At first, only a few voices spoke up, but as the weeks passed, more hands went up. People felt heard. That was everything. Clara became my right hand. She was intuitive, emotionally intelligent, and had a way of seeing patterns I sometimes missed. One afternoon, we sat on the rooftop terrace we'd converted into a break space and talked about everything that had happened. "You've changed," she said, sipping her tea. "How so?" I asked. "You used to fight like you had something to prove. Now you fight like you have something to protect." I let her words settle. She was right. The Natalie who had walked back into Brickman with fire in her veins was fueled by vengeance, by the need to show them all. But the Natalie sitting here now had a team to defend, a vision to guard, a culture to preserve. That required a different kind of strength, less about shouting, more about standing quietly and firmly when it mattered. Despite the wounds of betrayal, I found a strange sense of peace in those months. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing approval. I was making decisions because I believed in them. I knew I wouldn't always be right, but I also knew I could survive being wrong. That was liberating. One of the most transformative moments came unexpectedly. A young woman named Serena, barely 22, approached me after one of our Friday town halls. She was nervous, fidgeting with the sleeves of her blazer. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "For what? For being you. For showing that women can lead like this, that we don't have to act like men to be strong. You made me believe I could be more." My throat tightened, not because I hadn't heard praise before, but because I remembered being her, unsure, watching, hoping for someone to break the pattern. And now, unknowingly, I had become that someone. I placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You already are more. You just have to walk like it." After that, I started mentoring her directly. We created a shadowing program so junior staff could spend time with department heads. Watching Serena step into those rooms with growing confidence became one of my favorite parts of the week. I was no longer just building a company. I was building people. Still, there were moments when the pressure felt unbearable. Running a growing business meant constant choices. Hard ones. Letting go of employees who weren't adapting. Saying no to flashy offers that didn't align with our values. Turning down a potential merger with a national chain because it would have meant losing the identity we'd fought so hard to build. The money was tempting. The accolades even more so. But I knew better now. Some victories come dressed as opportunities, but if they cost you your soul, they're just another form of defeat. One particular evening stands out in my memory. The office had emptied, the city lights flickering against the windows, and I sat alone in the boardroom with a contract in front of me. It was an offer to buy Green Corps. Millions. Immediate wealth. Everything those men at Brickman had once told me I'd never have. But if I signed it, I'd lose control. The brand would be absorbed. The culture would shift. My team, my people, my purpose, all at risk. I stared at the pen for a long time. Then I pushed it away. My phone buzzed with a message from Clara. "Remember who you are." I did. I remembered the girl who had mopped floors, the woman who sat through business classes with no heat in her apartment, the leader who had stood up in front of her employees and promised they'd rise together. This was not the time to sell. This was the time to lead. We reinvested instead, launched a training program for underprivileged youth interested in supply chain management, partnered with a local nonprofit to support re-entry employment for formerly incarcerated women. Not just because it was good PR, but because I knew what it felt like to be discarded, and I knew what second chances could do. The public response was overwhelming. Media coverage, new contracts, awards I never even applied for. But the recognition didn't matter as much as the stories. A single mother getting her first paycheck and crying in our break room. A former inmate now managing one of our warehouse zones with pride. Those moments reminded me why I started this in the first place. Not just to prove I could be rich, but to prove that wealth meant more than numbers. Even so, the ghosts of my past made appearances. Donnie resurfaced in the news, caught up in an embezzlement scandal tied to a shell company. I read the article in silence, then folded the page and placed it in the same drawer where I'd kept his first note. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a strange, hollow awareness that some people never change, and that was their choice. Curtis, the old loyalist, sent me a handwritten letter. It was apologetic, heartfelt, and full of regrets. I didn't reply, not because I held hate in my heart, but because some doors once closed don't need reopening. Forgiveness didn't have to mean re-entry. One night, after a long strategy session with Clara, we sat on the rooftop again, wrapped in blankets, watching the moon hang low over Lakewood. "What's next for you?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "For the first time, I'm not chasing anything. I'm just building," she smiled. "Maybe that's what power really looks like." I nodded. Maybe it was. That spring, I stood once again at a conference podium. This time the topic was legacy through leadership. I looked out at the sea of faces, young, old, hungry, tired. I told them everything, the underestimation, the betrayal, the resilience. And then I said, the richest thing I ever built wasn't a company. It was belief in myself, in people, in second chances. That's what they couldn't predict. That's why I won. When I stepped off the stage, Serena was waiting with tears in her eyes. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You didn't just change your story, you changed mine." And in that moment, I knew. The fire they tried to smother had become a torch, one I could now pass on to others. Summer brought heat, growth, and a storm I never saw coming. Business was booming. Green Corps had not only recovered from the sabotage, it had surpassed projections, expanded its team, and become one of the fastest-growing logistics firms in the state. We were finally in talks with major tech developers in Denver and Colorado Springs for long-term contracts. Every week brought new opportunities. But success is loud, and the louder you become, the more attention you attract. And not all of it is welcome. It started with small, almost invisible tremors. A late delivery here, a document sent to the wrong vendor, an employee receiving an email that appeared to come from me. asking for sensitive files. At first, we thought it was simple human error, glitches, overwork. But something in my gut told me different. We were being targeted again. This time, not from the inside. It was digital, precise, and sophisticated. Someone out there didn't just want to see Green Core stumble. They wanted to see it collapse. I called Clara into my office and laid everything out. We brought in the cybersecurity team again. What they found confirmed my instincts. Green Core had been the subject of a coordinated cyber attack. Someone had hacked our internal server through a vulnerability in a third-party logistics platform. They hadn't stolen money, at least not directly. They were after something else. Client lists, supplier pricing, internal strategy documents. The breach was serious enough to require a public statement. I crafted the announcement myself. Transparent, calm, honest. I stood in front of a podium in our own building, flanked by Clara and our new IT director, and told the press everything. I admitted the breach, outlined what we were doing to contain it, and promised we would protect every single partner and employee. It was the hardest speech I'd ever had to make, not because of the content, but because I knew that in the world of business, trust once shaken is not easily restored. As the days passed, the media frenzy quieted, but the consequences lingered. 2 potential investors backed out. 1 major client paused their expansion deal. Rumors once again began to circulate. Some said I wasn't experienced enough to run a company of our size. Others said Green Core had grown too fast, too soon. I had spent years climbing, only to be dragged back to the edge by forces beyond my control. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I didn't crumble. I got angry. I took a drive to clear my head. Just me, my old blue SUV, and the winding mountain roads outside of Lakewood. I parked near a ridge and sat looking out over the valley. The wind was loud, the kind that drowns out everything except your own breathing. I closed my eyes and remembered being 23, sitting on a park bench with a notebook full of business plans no one believed in. I remembered getting laughed at in meetings, told to stay in my lane, told I wasn't qualified. And I remembered the moment I walked back into Brickman as its owner. That flame reignited in my chest. The one I had been too tired to feel lately. This wasn't the end. This was the test. The next day, I assembled my executive team in our largest conference room. I stood at the head of the table with every piece of data, every loss, every bit of fallout spread before me. Then I said, "We don't retreat. We reinforce." It became our motto. We launched a full rebrand campaign, new logo, stronger messaging, updated security promises. Clara spearheaded the effort, partnering with a brilliant ad firm that helped us tell our story not as victims of an attack, but as survivors who were now stronger, wiser, and more equipped to lead the industry. We didn't hide the breach. We owned it. Every billboard, every ad, every social media post drove home one message: we learn, we adapt, we lead. Then came the phone call that would push everything to the edge. A reporter contacted us saying they had information that the attack was orchestrated by none other than Northedge Logistics, the same company Jeremy had worked with during the internal sabotage. Apparently, a whistleblower had come forward with documents showing a direct connection between the breach and a consultant hired by Northedge to disrupt competing logistics firms. I was stunned. Not surprised, but stunned. The level of obsession, the length they had gone to see us fail. It was almost cinematic. But now, we had proof. Real, legal, irrefutable proof. We brought it to our legal team. They prepared a lawsuit. But I knew this had to be more than a courtroom battle. This was personal. They hadn't just targeted a company. They had targeted a dream. My dream. They had tried to strip me of everything I'd built. Before the suit was filed, I made one final move. I called a press conference and, with my lawyers beside me, announced our lawsuit publicly. I named Northedge. I presented the evidence. I told the story, again, of a woman who had been mocked, underestimated, betrayed, and how even after all that, she stood taller than ever. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled. The air was thick with tension and awe. The aftermath was like watching a tidal wave hit a wall. Northedge issued a weak denial, but within days, their social media was flooded with backlash. Clients began distancing themselves. Internal leaks revealed the CEO had known about the cyber attack plans. The SEC opened an investigation. Their stock plummeted. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. But I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Meanwhile, Greencore's phones rang constantly. Clients expressing support. Investors asking how they could help. Former critics now turning into allies. And then, in the quiet corner of my inbox, an email arrived. From Donnie. Subject: Congratulations. The body of the message was only one sentence. I didn't see it back then, but you were always the one to watch. I stared at it for a long time, then hit delete. I had no space in my life for ghosts seeking redemption too late. That summer, we closed a deal with one of the largest renewable construction firms in the western U.S. Greencore, became their exclusive supply chain partner. The contract secured jobs, expanded benefits, and guaranteed growth for the next 5 years. When I stood in front of our employees to announce the news, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't emotional. I was steady. They erupted in cheers, claps, hugs. Some cried. I just stood there and watched them celebrate. That was my victory. Not the money, not the lawsuits, not the headline interviews or the sudden flood of recognition. It was seeing people believe in something that once lived only in my imagination. Watching a building that used to be cold and gray now filled with life, with laughter, with people who were proud to come to work. In one final board meeting before the fiscal year closed, Clara looked over the numbers and grinned. "You did it," she said. "No," I replied. "We did it." She paused. "But you lit the fire." And maybe I had. Maybe I'd always been holding the match. But what I realized, standing there with everything I'd fought for surrounding me, was that revenge had never really been the goal. Revenge was the spark. Purpose was the flame. And purpose, that doesn't burn out. The days that followed the lawsuit and the victory with the renewable energy deal felt different. Not louder, not even particularly celebratory, just full. Like the company had taken a deep breath and now exhaled into a version of itself that was finally settled. I walked through the halls of Greencore and saw faces I didn't recognize anymore. Not because they were new, but because they were transformed. The interns were now department leads. The women who once hesitated to speak now ran meetings with confidence. The young man from shipping, who once arrived late and unsure, now organized our entire delivery grid with near-military precision. And I had changed too, not just in status, or appearance, or title, but in silence. In the way I processed moments. I no longer felt the need to defend my place at the table. I was the table, and the building, and the fire escape behind it. I had spent so long building a world where I wouldn't be excluded that I had almost forgotten what inclusion truly looked like. But now I understood. Real power wasn't something I had to grip. It was something I could extend. There was a time when I believed the ultimate satisfaction would be watching everyone who doubted me fall, lose their jobs, eat their words. But the deeper I got into this journey, the more I understood that their downfall meant nothing if I wasn't becoming someone worth rooting for. The final form of revenge, I learned, isn't cruelty. It's creation. Not what you destroy, but what you build in the shadow of the destruction. One of the most important days of that year came quietly, tucked between 2 budget meetings and a phone call with our software supplier. I was walking back from the warehouse when I passed the conference room where I used to sit in silence while others talked over me. Now it was filled with junior employees presenting a proposal on sustainable transport methods. I paused outside the glass and watched Serena leading the presentation, standing tall, her voice steady, her words sharp. She noticed me. She smiled. And kept going. That moment, more than any check, more than any contract, was proof of impact. It reminded me that what we do in the face of rejection doesn't just affect us. It ripples outward. A few weeks later, I received an invitation. The Colorado Business Council wanted to honor me at their annual gala with the Resilient Leader Award. It was the same event Donnie had once bragged about attending. I hesitated before accepting, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because the idea of standing in front of a crowd and talking about resilience felt incomplete. How do you explain to a room of strangers what it means to rebuild yourself from the ashes of someone else's opinion? Still, I accepted. I wore a black suit that night, tailored but simple, and as I took the stage, I felt every heartbeat in the room waiting. I wasn't supposed to be here, I began. Not just on this stage. I mean here, leading, succeeding, surviving. When I was 23, someone told me I'd never be rich. They laughed when I asked for more responsibility. They said I wasn't built for leadership, that I was sweet, but not strong. But they were wrong. Not because I was secretly brilliant, not because I had a trust fund, but because I made a choice to believe that every no was just a delayed yes, that every rejection was redirection, and that every time I was pushed down, I could choose to get up, not bitter, but better. I looked out into the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes. The silence was complete. I bought their company, I said, and I didn't just fire them, I rewrote the rules. Applause erupted, but I didn't let it sit too long. I tell you this not to glorify revenge, I continued, but to remind you that no one gets to decide your worth. Not a boss, not a title, not a rejection letter. You do, every day, in every choice, in every moment when you decide to rise instead of retreat. Later that evening, as I sat with Clara sipping water with lemon and listening to jazz echo through the ballroom, I turned to her and said, "I think I'm finally done fighting." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" I smiled. "Yeah, I think it's time to start teaching." And that's exactly what I did. We launched Green Core U, an in-house leadership development program for women in logistics and operations. I partnered with small colleges to offer scholarships for young women who wanted to enter the industry. We created mentorship programs. We offered second chances to people who didn't have perfect resumes but had drive, heart, and discipline, because I knew what it was like to be passed over, and I never wanted to be the reason someone else felt like they weren't enough. Sometimes people from the past would reach out, old classmates, former colleagues, even Donnie's assistant who had once laughed when I spilled coffee on my blouse during my first week. She messaged me on LinkedIn and asked if I remembered her. I did. But I also remembered that everyone grows differently, so I responded politely, wished her well, and kept moving forward. I had nothing to prove anymore. Clara eventually became co-CEO. She had earned it in every way. Her vision balanced mine, her strength matched mine, and together we expanded Green Core into 5 states. We opened a regional headquarters in Salt Lake City. We began developing our own supply chain software. We even started working with international partners. The girl who once delivered coffee now consulted for global logistics firms. I bought a house outside of Lakewood, quiet, surrounded by trees. I planted a small garden, something I had always dreamed of but never had time for. And on slow mornings, I'd walk barefoot through the grass, breathing in the life I had built with my own hands. Sometimes, I'd open the old drawer in my study and look at the 2 things I kept from my past: Donnie's note and the news article about Northedge's downfall. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I kept them as reminders, not of the pain, but of the path, of how far I had come. People still asked me what motivated me, what fueled me, and my answer was always the same: being underestimated. It's the fire you never forget, the push you never stop feeling. But eventually, you realize that fire doesn't have to burn you forever. You can turn it into warmth, into light, into something that guides others. The truth is, they did me a favor. Every dismissal, every insult, every limitation, they all became bricks. And I built something with them. Not a wall to hide behind. A bridge, a tower, a home. Because success isn't just about proving people wrong, it's about proving yourself right. About taking everything they said you couldn't do and doing it anyway. Not for spite, but for peace. They said I'd never be rich, so I bought their business. I fired them all, and then I became something far more powerful than rich. I became whole. Years passed. Seasons folded into each other like pages in a book, and with each chapter, my life evolved in ways I never could have anticipated. Green Core was no longer just a company, it was a movement, a standard, a legacy in motion. What began as a reclamation of dignity had transformed into a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to stay small. And with that came responsibility, not just to my team or my investors, but to every young woman watching from the sidelines, wondering if her voice mattered. The world didn't slow down. Business kept expanding. Opportunities kept coming. But somewhere along the way, the pace within me shifted. I started making decisions not from a place of survival, but from a place of vision. I stopped reacting and began creating. We expanded into Mexico and Canada, launched our own fleet of eco-efficient delivery vehicles, and even opened our own training institute in Denver for underrepresented voices in supply chain management. My days were still full, my calendars still packed, but the pressure no longer felt like a weight. It felt like wind beneath everything I was building. And yet, there were quieter victories too. Things that didn't make headlines but filled the corners of my life with peace. I started teaching part-time at a local college, offering a course on leadership resilience. Every semester, a new wave of students walked into my classroom, some confident, some unsure, all of them carrying dreams too big to say out loud. I always began with the same words. I wasn't supposed to be here either. And then I told them everything, the whole story, because they needed to know that success wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. Serena, now head of our operations division, stood next to me during our annual conference and presented on innovation in crisis management. She was a force, commanding, articulate, strategic. And afterward, she found me backstage and whispered, "You changed my life." I smiled. "You changed it. I just reminded you it was possible." Even Clara had grown into someone more than a colleague. She was family. The kind of person who showed up when things went wrong and stayed long after the dust settled. She had been through heartbreak, loss, triumph, and transition alongside me. We traveled together for conferences, sat in red-eye flights reviewing documents, got caught in the rain walking back from meetings in Paris. And one rainy afternoon, as we ducked under an awning, she looked at me and said, "We did more than build a company, Nat. We built a culture, a space where women lead without apology." It struck me then that all the sleepless nights, the betrayals, the sacrifice, they weren't just about proving them wrong. They were about proving to others, and to myself, that worth doesn't have to be requested. It can be claimed. Still, the past finds ways to echo. I received a letter one morning, tucked beneath a stack of vendor proposals. It was handwritten, neat, cursive script. It was from Jeremy. He had completed a rehabilitation program, was working for a nonprofit that trained formerly incarcerated individuals in digital literacy. The letter was short, apologetic, and full of accountability. He never asked for forgiveness, only expressed hope that one day his mistake could serve as a lesson for someone else. I read it twice, then placed it in the same drawer as the others. But I didn't label it fuel this time. I labeled it closure, because I had nothing left to carry. The fire had already forged me. I didn't need it anymore. I started writing a book. Not a memoir exactly. More like a guide stitched with story. Each chapter focused on one lie I had once believed, like, you have to be liked to be successful, or only men can lead in logistics, or you can't come back from failure. I wrote it in the early mornings before the sun rose, in coffee shops where no one knew my name, in airports between gates, in quiet rooms filled with the scent of old paper and new ideas. And when the book was finished, I didn't feel nervous. I felt ready, like I had completed something that would outlive the sound of my own voice. It became a bestseller, not because I was famous, but because people were hungry for truth, for something raw, something earned. I started getting letters from young women all over the world. One from India, another from Nigeria, one from a tiny town in Oregon. They all said the same thing in different ways. Your story gave me permission to try, and that's what I had wanted all along. Not to be remembered as someone who had it all, but as someone who built what she was told she couldn't. Green Corps held its 10-year anniversary gala in a historic venue in downtown Denver. The lights were soft, the music elegant, and every table was filled with people who had been part of the journey, partners, staff, mentors, community leaders. There were speeches, toasts, laughter. I stood near the back for most of the night just watching, letting it soak in. The building pulsed with energy. Not ambition, not ego, but gratitude. Clara pulled me to the side just before dinner. "You're going to have to speak, you know." I groaned. "Can't someone else do it?" "Nope. Tonight, they want you." I took the stage in a midnight blue dress. Simple but strong, the kind of thing I would have never worn back in the Brickman days. I looked out into the sea of faces and tried to speak past the lump in my throat. A decade ago, I was called a receptionist with an attitude problem. I was told I'd never be rich, that I wasn't leadership material, that I should stay where I was, be grateful for the scraps, and for a while I believed them. I really did, until I didn't. I paused. Tonight, we celebrate more than just numbers or contracts. We celebrate belief, in ourselves, in each other, in the idea that we get to rewrite the stories we're handed. Applause rose like a wave. As I stepped off stage, a woman approached me. She looked to be in her late 50s, elegant, serious eyes. She introduced herself as the daughter of Brickman Supply's original founder. She'd been watching quietly for years, she said. She wanted to tell me that her father would have been impressed, not just by what I built, but by how I carried it. She shook my hand and said, "You didn't just restore what they broke. You elevated it." And that night, as I lay in bed, watching shadows from the streetlights move across my ceiling, I thought about everything I had lost, and everything I had found. There had been no shortcuts, no magical moments, just grit, just pain turned into progress, just the choice, over and over again, to rise. I no longer woke up with the need to prove anything. I didn't flinch when people doubted me. I didn't hesitate to speak. I had walked through fire, and now I carried my own light. They said I'd never be rich, so I built an empire. They said I was too emotional, so I led with heart. They said I wasn't strong enough, so I made strength look like grace. And in the quiet moments when I walk the halls of the company I once only dreamed about, I hear the echo of my younger self, still scared, still hopeful, and I whisper back, "We made it." Not because we followed their path, but because we built our own. And in doing so, we lit the way for others. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough, only to prove everyone wrong by building the life they said you'd never have? Leave a comment below and share your story. I want to hear from those who've turned pain into power. If my journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more true stories of resilience, leadership, and unexpected redemption. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that they can rise above what was meant to break them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your worth isn't decided by their doubts. It's built by your courage.